welcome back to Commerce Reimagined. I am Beth Ann Kamenko. I'm the CEO of Commerce at VMLY&R, and I'm very pleased to be joined with Chris Walton. He is one of the leading omnichannel experts in the world, with nearly 20 years of success within the retail and retail technology industries. He is very well versed, and we're going to hear some of that today. But for those that are already following Chris, you know this well. Almost on all things, everything retail, including merchandising, store operations, inventory management, product design, forecasting, e-commerce, pricing and promotions, product development, store design, and architecture. So he is, front of the house retail, behind the scenes retail, and, really understands everything that we're going to be diving into today, and brings, just so much knowledge with him. He currently is the CEO and founder of Third House, the retail lab joint venture with Xenia Retail, and OmniTalk, one of the fastest growing blogs in retail, which I'm sure is how many of you may know him already. And if you don't, definitely worth checking out. He's also, in addition, a regular contributor to Forbes, Retail Dive, and the Robin Report, which I follow religiously. Again, we're just so pleased to have you, Chris, with us today. I know that you also had your kind of prior experience working directly at Target as a vice president of merchandising in home furnishings on Target.com as well, and a myriad of working personally at Target stores. So cannot be asking for a better person as we enter what I always think of as sort of like Super Bowl season of shopping. As we get into, we've already had 11/11, and now we're going to get into sort of the Black Friday, which is now an entire month kicking off into the holiday season. So I can't wait to get into all of your insights around this. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. That was a great intro. Great intro. Hopefully it's deserving as we go through this podcast. But yeah, you're right. I mean, feels like Black Friday's been going on for at least a month, if not almost 2 months now, given when Amazon starts doing Prime Day activity in October. It's just nuts how it's all evolved.
It really is. And so tell me from your perspective, and I'm sure that's meaning you're drawing from data and insight in this, space, and all the things that you follow and cover and people that you talk to. But is it worth it? Like, is this working for first the retailer point of view? And then do you think this is worth it for the manufacturers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Actually, it's funny. I went on record as predicting that Amazon would pull forward Black Friday, I think back in 2017, one of the very first few things I wrote. And turns out they did. They started doing Prime Days in early October. And I think for the most part, it's a smart move. I mean, Amazon's doing it because they want to pull forward the demand, right? Like if you can use online's a great channel when you can pull forward demand. And there's a lot of new examples of that, which we can talk about here, as well, depending on what direction you want to go. But so for that reason, I think it's good for both parties. It's good for the retailers. It's good for the CPGs and the manufacturers too, because you get an earlier read on demand, and that means less inventory, at the end of the season that you're stuck with having to liquidate. So, and also at the end of the day, the consumer wins too, because they get more deals more often and more frequently. So, it's a win-win all around, in my opinion.
Well, let's talk about inventory, though, because I would imagine that some manufacturers might be getting caught off guard with the amount of inventory to respond to the demand. Is that something that we need to be worried about? And if so, like which categories do you see that?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you're doing your job correctly, if you're partnering with the retailers right on both sides, you're having these discussions from a very long point of view out, and there shouldn't be any surprises. Like, especially at enterprise level retail, which is the bulk of what we're really talking about here, there shouldn't be any surprises, because you can't just turn these promotions on a dime necessarily. And if you are, it's probably because you're needing to liquidate something based on price. And so for the most part, these conversations should be well coordinated and had in that way. So from that standpoint, I don't really see a big issue.
And so tell me about how you see the rest of the year playing out then, because I can kind of remember a time where everything was about sort of seasonal moments that you had that were must win for retailers and manufacturers and for the consumer. And we used to shop by those seasons, but now we really don't anymore. I mean, even Christmas shopping, as we know, is starting in July, and we have the promotions that are pulling us into that seasonality. Like, what does that mean for the rest of the year? Like, how do we start planning out our year differently, knowing what is to come in the latter part of the year?
That's a great question too. I mean, I think it's tough. Like when I step back, and it's funny that you mentioned that. I haven't thought about this in a while, but I used to I used to joke that there's like, I don't remember how many, but I think 6 standard seasons of retailing, right? Like the key holidays that you just have to win and you have to have a position on. I don't think that's fundamentally changed. I think what's changed is the bullets in the chamber by which we have to attack those holidays, right? And so like Prime Day or early October deal days, you know, whether it's Target or Walmart, is just another bullet in the chamber to attack that season. So I think it's just more multifaceted in that regard. And so, like I said before, it gives the retailer more opportunities for touch points with their consumer and for the brands as well. And that's ultimately a good thing. And that creates more diversity in retailing. It creates more deals in retailing. It creates more excitement around retailing. So I don't think fundamentally, it's funny. We always joke on our show too, what's old is new again. The seasons are still the same. What's new is how we're talking about them and how we're activating around them. That's what's fundamentally different. So to answer your question, I don't think there's anything that's really changed part and parcel. It's just there's new dynamics at play.
So let's talk about those dynamics. You teed it up beautifully. You know, how are we activating differently and just presenting ourselves differently through these opportunities?
Yeah, great question. And it's especially timely too, in light of last week's big announcement with Amazon striking a deal with Meta by way of Instagram and Facebook. That's really interesting because, you know, social commerce, especially when you talk about the inspirational side of retailing, because there's two sides of retail, really, especially in the digital world. There's the inspiration based or there's the search based. I know what I want to go get it. This is the other side of that coin, right? This is I want to discover things while I'm going through my feed, scrolling endlessly through my feed. And Amazon smartly has tried to get into the social commerce sphere. They tried Spark a few years ago. They shuttered that because it was an absolute failure, and no surprise why, because it's hard to create a 2 billion plus social media network like Meta has, right?
Right.
And so now they're joining forces. They're saying you can't beat them, join them. Both sides are really. And that's really interesting to me too, because that's another, like I said, bullet in the chamber by which to talk to the consumer. So now Amazon can talk directly to the consumer. The consumer can shop via ads in Facebook, in Instagram, without ever leaving the the Instagram or Facebook app, and have the confidence that they're buying from Amazon. And so that's critically important. And so that's really just the first mile of this marathon in terms of how social commerce is going to evolve, especially over these seasons and these key time periods. So there's other companies that are doing similar things. Like I look at Sephora and their work around localized inventory. They're trying to approximate the same thing with their advertising by way of technology to enable them to enable their consumers to still click and buy within a great experience via social commerce. So more and more companies are going to jump into this. This is an area or a space from a technology standpoint that I think is going to be really, really hot over the next few years.
And so from a social platform standpoint, when you start to think about who the winners are going to be, is that primarily who we're thinking about today and where we're spending our time, like TikTok and Instagram, or do you see other players emerging in the space?
It's a great question too. I don't really see other players emerging in the social commerce space. I mean, I take that with a grain of salt too, because no one saw TikTok coming. TikTok hasn't been around that long either. So there could be new players that do social commerce differently. But I think how the retailers and the manufacturers will play in whatever those platforms are won't change very much, which is very different than how things have emerged in China, as an example. In China, those social commerce platforms are really the benchmark marketplaces for how retailing is done. Yep. Over here, it's different. And the Amazon and Meta partnership is a great example of this. Neither side wants to give up their share of the territory, so to speak. So they're partnering together on it. The retailers are going to do the same thing. The retailers, like especially the big guys, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Home Depots of the world, they've got the brand, they've got the cachet. They're not going to turn that over to the social commerce platforms and make them the next wave of retail. They're going to try to keep everything on their platforms as much as possible. And so therefore it is going to be technologies like I talked about, localized inventory awareness that combined with your advertising that enable you to do that. How you do shoppable video or live stream commerce and where you house all of those assets is going to become another important part of that evolution too. So net social commerce, the key platforms are here. There may be a new entrant, but how retailers, decide to carve up the landscape, I think will be very similar to how it's been carved up historically.
So do you see more deals coming on the backs of this now? Like when we think about YouTube, if you think about some of the other streaming services, making more content shoppable for people, again, looking to China, it's like amazing to me actually that we're still so far behind in so many ways. But do you think 2024 is sort of the year that we're going to see more of these deals and more of this kind of seamless ability to start thinking about shopping front and center?
Yeah, I do, because of what I said before. Like
Mhm.
digital commerce is predicated upon two things. It's predicated on search and discovery. The search battle's happening, and that's still being waged fully between Amazon and Google. And Google had some recent announcements too in terms of making discount searching easier for their end consumers too, which is another discussion that we could talk about if you want. But so on the so that's a slice of the business, right? It's going to happen. Now, more and more search is also happening on Instagram and happening on TikTok and things of that nature. Google's execs came out and said that actually in the last year. But the other side of this is discovery. So this discovery is still a chunk of the business. It's that unexpected serendipitous moment. And the retailers aren't going to want to lose that. They're going to have to keep that. And so if they risk losing that to Amazon because Amazon's making it easy, they're going to have to follow suit. So yes, 100%.
Or TikTok. I mean,
or TikTok.
My discovery in my life, maybe it's very narrow in terms of what I'm discovering, but it's happening through like the TikTok inspiration and influence.
Well, and that's a great point too, because the one piece we don't know about this yet, and we talked about this on our weekly podcast last week, is what will Amazon do with TikTok? And so that actually puts the onus on all of the rest of retail to figure out how to make this happen inside of TikTok, where they still control that experience as best as they can. But does TikTok want to allow that? That's the big $64,000 question. I don't think any of us.
Or do American companies or companies that are primarily doing business here want to allow that? And we won't get into that side of the conversation, but
right. Yes.
One that adds a lot of complexity.
Far above you and I. Yes.
Exactly. You've kind of said so many things within your answers where it was like kind of make a note to come back to, go a little bit deeper. And so I'm trying to like keep up as well, just to remember some of the things we want to come back to. I mean, some of it gets into sort of just the consumer experience of all of this as well. One of the questions I've been asked recently as we get into the holiday season is just I think maybe it's partly because consumers are becoming more and more aware that there's an algorithm at play. Maybe because so much of our purchasing is happening on, in the Walmart environment or in an Amazon. And so we get a sense of what is tracking and, what is being served up to us. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, in terms of, algorithmic shopping and, kind of the value in that. How do we continue to make sure as we work with, again, retailers and companies that we're doing things that are, on behalf of the consumer versus things that start getting into that zone of just feeling like you're targeting me and it feels creepy, or you're not aware that I actually already made that purchase and you're still serving up things that are the exact thing that I just bought.
Yeah.
Like, how do we get into that personalization with value?
That's one of my favorite topics. One of my least favorite words in all of retail, and especially when I go to all the trade shows that I go to, is personalization. I think it's the most overused word in retail because anything can be personalized, right? And a lot of those examples you just described, they're personalized, but they're not personalized well.
No.
And so what we're really searching for is relevance. That's the key thing. And all of us as consumers, I think, want a more relevant experience. And that's the trade-off that ultimately comes with how much data do you hand over as the consumer? And then what do I get in return, and how relevant is the experience that the retailer is creating for me? That's ultimately the goal. I wish I had a better answer for you in terms of like how to do it, or like advice on what makes one retailer more successful at that than another. I really don't, but that's the end goal. And I think that's what people need to keep in mind. It's not just about personalization for personalization's sake. It's about relevancy for relevance sake. And that is why we enter in as consumers into this agreement with the retailer to say, okay, I'll give you my data to a certain degree, as long as you're giving me something of value for it. And that's generally speaking what the great companies do. Like Amazon with Prime has made Prime so much more valuable for the consumer and so much more tailored and relevant to them, to each individual on an individual basis. That's what continues to make it successful.
Yeah. And when I think about that, though, and I start to think about it from a full ecosystem of the retailer, and this is less applicable to Amazon, and especially Amazon pulling away from some of the physical experiences, but you have spent a lot of your time in physical retail. So like, how do you pull that through to a physical retail experience? And maybe Sephora I always think about this from the lens of Sephora or a Starbucks, like the places where the physical environment is so critically important to their performance?
Yeah, that's an awesome question too. I mean, I think it's a tough challenge. It's a tough nut to crack because physical retail experiences are not personalized to us,
Right.
for the most part. And for the most part, as a retailer, even a brand, we don't know anything that the consumer is doing inside the store. We don't really know anything until they check out at the till, at the register, and understand what they purchased. And by that point, it's too late. And so what are retailers doing to change that, to digitize their understanding of the physical store, much in the same way they understand what we were talking about in terms of how browser relevancy or personalization works, right? That's the ultimate goal of everyone. And so I think there's a few proxies for it right now. I'd say number one is, unlocking the physical experiences by way of mobile apps and mobile app usage. So curbside pickup, started during the pandemic. It was around forever, but it really started during the pandemic, full bore. That's a new way to talk to consumers, right? And that enables you to engage with them in new ways, to show them new things as they're at least entering the threshold of your store. And it gives you the ability to correlate data against that. The next generation of that, though, is a big question. There's a lot of talk around retail media networks, but how do you bring those to life in store? How do you capture the data? That's still an unsolved question for the most part. You really have to get into the realm of computer vision applications inside a store. And there's some good examples of that, like Amazon. You mentioned Amazon. Yeah. They're the ones doing it, but of course they don't know how to do physical retail stores. So it's just not that prevalent yet. But another one that I like, another great example of someone doing things on the front edge of that is Schnucks, the grocer out of St. Louis. They are doing a lot with computer vision to make their stores run better. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, at the end of the day, too, sometimes a better running store can be a more personalized store, or at least can feel that way for the consumer, because you have what I want. It's priced correctly. It's actually on the shelf. That's the first realm of personalizing the store. And then you can get into all the bells and whistles later on.
Yeah. And like moving to the bells and whistles, there's been a lot of attempts to add bells and whistles to the physical environment, and everything from things that were technology that drove you down to your mobile app so much that you were heads down versus heads up in order to have an experience, which we've now seen that play out. You and I talked last time about show fields and, yes. What the promise of that kind of a space would be with the assortment that they could offer, with the, constantly turning modularity of things, and just more pliable space that made it a super interesting shoppable environment, but at the end of the day, not economically sustainable. And then we even talked about like an Amazon. So an Amazon who, for their own reasons, were moving into the physical environment, I'm sure, to capture data another way. So it was also maybe more for their value in some ways, but that also hasn't yet proven to really work for them. So I'd love your thoughts on what are the things that these brands should be doing to create a sustainable future to that physical environment, and to offer at the same time this different level of engagement that wasn't possible before?
Yeah, to answer that question, for me, it always comes down to data capture. Like, you have to have a system of data capture in your store, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Computer vision is one. Even a scan and go system of checkout, of understanding where people are in the store is another prong of that. Yeah. But you have to be able to understand it too. That's the tricky part. And so, Amazon, as much as we give it flack for its forays into physical retail thus far, is actually seemingly having quite a lot of success in licensing their Just Walk Out technology, particularly in events and stadium surroundings. And the idea being there that, people don't have time to wait for a beer. They don't have time to wait for food. They want to get back in before the next inning. And people are using it, and they're understanding it. They're adopting it more. And Amazon, by that token, is getting that data then of who's coming in. They know who it is that's purchasing. They know what they're purchasing. They know how long they're going to be there. That has tremendous value to them and to the operator that they're licensing that technology, to whom they're licensing that technology as well. So, and that's the most souped up case of it, honestly. So, but it gets back to the question of, okay, well, what do you do if you don't have that? If you can't do that? Sure. And then I think it gets into more, brass tacks of, okay, what can you record? What data can you capture? And it's amazing the things you can do now. I mean, there's new advances in barcoding, which enable you to understand the expiration dates of products that are linked to the point of sale. So you make sure your customer never walks out with expired food as an example. There's robots that can roam the aisle to search for inventory outs and pricing correct, and to ensure that pricing is correct on shelves as well. Any realm of those technologies, when put together, even electronic shelf labels to some degree that correlate with those types of activities to ensure that prices are right on shelf all the time. Any degree of those can be used in concert with each other so that 1 + 1 = 3 as you try to create this kind of data understanding of what's happening in the physical store. And when it's done well, honestly, there's a number of technologies, probably too many to go into even for this conversation, where 1 + 1 + 1 = 4 ultimately at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's sometimes maybe invisible technology to the consumer or to the consumer experience, but it is what helps behind the scenes to really think about the experience that we can deliver to the consumer differently. Yeah. So on that Schofield,
Yeah.
love to come back to it just because I'm obsessed with the summer, for instance, economically, the impact that like the Barbie movie had, and the Eras Tour has had. And we think about things like being able to, be more spontaneous with merchandising strategies and with being able to, collab or, figure out the right intersecting points with some of these mashups in a space that is, not necessarily planned with the same kind of lead times, or has that bit of like sort of spontaneous modularity to it. Like what does it require for that to succeed? Or what, I know you're not very much a fan of pop-up, but I would love to hear your thoughts and why you feel the way you feel.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it goes back to what we started talking about in the beginning. Quite honestly, I think when I think temporary brand installations or quick ways to talk to the consumer, digital is the way to go. It's just that much more malleable. When you start talking about physical infrastructure, it's very costly. There's a lot that has to go into that. There's a lot of make. And then also the question becomes, if it doesn't sell well, what do you do with the inventory at the end of the season? And that's the ultimate question that makes pop-up retailing so difficult, or why pop-up retailing is hard to do in any sustainable way outside of maybe some big city installations where you're going to get traffic, right?
Yep.
But that's what's really interesting about going back to the part we talked about in the beginning around, but digital enables you to have so many more touch points. You can bring live streaming in, you can bring, drops concepts in, like Nike or Best Buy's doing this year, all in a new way that basically accomplish the same thing from a branding perspective. You've mentioned Schofield's a couple of times. I think so. Schofield's had those issues going against it. And then the other issue that it has going against it, same with that I thought Beta had going against it when it tried a very similar business model too, was you're leasing your real estate to the most untrue brands. There's a reason those brands are coming to you. It's because they're not necessarily ready for prime time for mass wholesale throughout the country. And that becomes a tricky business model as you try to roll or scale throughout the country or make yourself a bigger entity, as in Schofield's.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can almost see a different type of retail strategy where you think of hotels and their retail little, environments that they have within the hotel for guest shops or whatever. You get local brands, more trialing in, on their shelves or something like that, that may, be a better way of kind of starting to test the consumer, get out there with some awareness. But I hear you in terms of like, it's almost too much that's experimenting all at once for something like that at that scale to be able to be sustainable.
Yeah. And the other point I'd make too is local brands are local for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, kind of staying very hyper local and true to that. So going the opposite direction to kind of start to end the conversation on, I've been so impressed and obviously work very closely with, so some of that has got a tad bit of bias to it, but how Walmart has been able to succeed and really continue to go up against Amazon. And I think, I have always been a believer that great competition makes everyone better. And, being really clear, knowing who your competition is, but knowing what you do differently and what your skills and strengths are. I know you cover this space a lot as well, but when you think about what Walmart has done well and also what they could be doing better, how would you start to kind of express that in your view?
Yeah, I think Walmart, Walmart's, I mean, we have an end of year show that we do on our podcast where we do the annual awards, and Walmart is by far and away going to win my Retailer of the Year award. Just because, yeah, right. I know, just because of just how well they've done. I think they even won it last year, if I remember right, from my perspective,
Wow, 2 years in a row.
So, yeah. Right. And there's a reason for that, because they've done a really good job, and they've done a good job on a number of fronts. I think, number one, they stood up to Amazon's physical retail onslaught by way of grocery and basically said, look, there's a lot you got to learn before you can enter this territory. And, who knows, maybe they will, but for the most part, they're seemingly in a pretty good spot. And, Walmart also stood up and said, hey, we're the place you want to come in this time of inflation, and you can count on us to have what you need. And by the same token, over the last few years, particularly, I think it really started, just before the pandemic, and then it really hit into gear as well. Both Walmart and Sam's Club, actually, Sam's Club is really their innovation arm. If you stop and really get into it, that's where they're learning how to do a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But they've evolved with the customer. They've had curbside pickup. They've stood up a media network. They've gone after a Walmart Plus subscription. They now have Walmart Commerce Technologies, Walmart Go Local, all these extensions of their business that in a lot of ways are very Amazon-esque. But when you have 4,000 plus physical stores that are the bulk of your retail, it's okay to be Amazon-esque, because you can hold off Amazon and just start doing what they're doing and take some of their margin a little bit over time as well. So that's what I like about them. What I think they could be doing better, though, quite honestly, is I would like to see them extend into this smart store realm a little bit more than they've had. They've had some starts on it. At a store in New York a couple of years ago, they were trying to do something like this. Yeah. But that almost felt too souped up to me. And my big lesson from this too is there's data, and there's real time, and then there's just the data that I need. And I think the lesson to be learned for all of us going through this is actually just getting the data that you need is the most important thing right now. You don't need all the bells and whistles. So I'd like to see Walmart come back at that to some degree in terms of their smart store design, which I think they are, because they announced this year that they're rolling out electronic shelf labels to a good number of their stores, which is one of the key elements of a smart store design. So I'm curious to see where they take it from there on the computer vision angle, combined with the shelf labels to create the better experiences that ultimately they can do from combining those technologies.
You mentioned computer vision a few different times. So for more of our layman listeners, what exactly does that mean?
So computer vision, put simply, it's the best way to think about it. It's the technology that powers an autonomous vehicle. Ultimately, it's a big souped up camera that uses AI to inform whoever's using it of what's happening in the surroundings. And so a retailer will put it in a store by way of many different. You can do this across a whole different realm of substrates. You can put it on a robot that goes through the store. You can put it in a ceiling. You can put it on a shelf, and the idea is that the camera is looking to see what's happening in the store. It's monitoring how people and products move in space over time, day in and day out. And it can be as real time as you want, depending on the computing power. But that is what gives you the understanding of how people and products are moving inside a physical space, in the same way that we understand how people and products are moving on a web browser or a desk or a mobile app as we're shopping today.
So could it be used to help security and shrinkage as well? Or is that going a bit too far?
100% it could. Yes, it could definitely be that's a great question though, because there's some nuance to that question. It can definitely be used to detect shrinkage. Prevention of shrinkage is a possible application of it, but how you use it and how you deploy it, you'd have to go into a lot of specifics there. But for detection, 100%. For prevention, depends on how you deploy it.
So I know you're a massive Star Wars fan. Is this the stuff that starts to get really interesting to you when you start to geek out over, robots with this kind of ability to surveil and see things that was never possible before? And is this where these things start to intersect for you?
That's so funny. Yeah, I actually do think I do think robot. This could be the year of the robot. Maybe not 2024, but 2025 will be. And it's funny when I say that, because the robots as I'm thinking about them are not like the Android C3PO walking through our store. It's more like I was joking on my podcast last week. Like the one at Schnucks, it's basically like a mobile scanner at the TSA security line. That's all we're talking about here. And it's not invasive. It's, half the time you don't even know it's there. And so, and that type of robotic technology has been deployed throughout time. Like we've always tried to get more efficient. And so I think it's just about adjusting our cognitive understanding of what we're really talking about here and what's really at play. There's nothing to be ultimately scared of in terms of robots coming into our store. It's more just, let's bring computer vision in the store. Let's get the benefits of it. No one's going to complain about having the right items at the right price on shelf and getting employees more time to do the things that they need to do in store, because as we all know, staffing a store is more difficult than it's ever been.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these things, as you said, have been behind the scenes for a long time. So we're maybe just going to see that arm come a little bit closer in where it's more visible, and hopefully we all start to adjust. I was at Westfield, as you may know, and we were doing the same thing. We were trying to figure out like where, and it was the robot that like looked cute and, could be in the center for questions and navigation and things like that. But I think we are still a ways away from that kind of integration of robots to completely, help us with, to your point, of customer service and the things that are sometimes really hard to hire for now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The idea of HAL, from 2001. That's not what we're talking about here, folks. No.
Okay. So is there anything that you feel like I didn't ask you that you would think would make sense to add to this conversation?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I mean, do you have any? I'm curious. We talked beforehand about predictions. Do you have any predictions for this upcoming year? I'm curious. I may have one.
You may have one. I guess my prediction isn't like a good kind of prediction in terms of some of the technology that we're talking about and the advancements. I mean, I do think social commerce is going to be a headline for next year, finally. Not maybe as fully integrated as we'd like to see, but I absolutely see the kind of influence becoming more powerful and more fully seamlessly integrated into the ability to then purchase. And I also see like the influencer creator economy so tied to that, and the role that they're playing really as personal shoppers, if you will, in so many ways. And I think they should be getting the value that they're driving for brands. And I don't think it compromises them in terms of the integrity of the sell just because they may be sponsored. I think I think those things are going to become more normal and normalized for us. But the other prediction that I have, and I've always been, super bullish on the market and on spend, and haven't really seen, too much change in consumer spend and their ability, especially in a lot of the products that we work with. But I do think there's going to be a price sensitivity, and we're going to see kind of the backside of inflation really starting to hit pocketbooks. I think we're already seeing that, but I think as we go into Q1, especially coming off the holiday season, there is definitely going to be maybe a move to more price conscious private label purchasing and limiting purchases as much as possible.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the influencer for sure is going to become even more important given all the changes we're talking about in social commerce. Even Facebook going ad free, as an example, in Europe is going to push more emphasis on the influencer. So I 100% agree with that. The other point I'd mentioned too, that we haven't really talked about from a prediction standpoint, especially given the timeliness of when we're doing this recording, is Gen AI. We haven't really talked about generative AI as a concept. And I think it's just starting to get its sea legs in retail, but it's going to become much more powerful here as we go forward.
Yeah, that's when we'll have to do a whole nother conversation on and go deep into definitions and meanings and applications. And definitely it's going to get exciting. And I think to the point of even algorithms and to use the dirty word personalization or relevance,
right.
I think it's going to help there a lot. Well, Chris, it was a pleasure. I think we kind of overlap there on the gift giving side. So, but it's great to get your views on all of these things and really timely. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.